Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Mr. Bones' Horror Zone. On this week's episode, we're going to be going through the ages, going through history. What history? The history of horror comics. Now, this is just going to be a brief history of horror comics, because if it was anything other than that, we'd be here all day, and I don't want to waste your time. You guys got other stuff to do than sit here and watch a YouTube show? Or maybe you don't. I don't know. While there were horror-tinged comics prior to this point, and horror comics that were just comic books adapting pre-existing horror stories like Frankenstein and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The first true dedicated horror comic series, like it was a series that was every issue was horror, came in 1947 from Avon Publishing. It was an anthology series called Eerie. I've never actually read any of it, but it was from 47, so it might not be good. Or it might be, I don't know. A year later, a comic book series called Adventures into the Unknown was begun. It was a continuous series rather than an anthology, but horror, and full horror nonetheless. 1 year after that, in 1949, Timely Comics, who would later go on to become Marvel, who now has a stranglehold on the superhero movie genre, they would go on to create Amazing Mysteries issue number 32. Starting with issue number 32, it became a much more purely horror-based comic book series. In 1950, EC Comics published 3 different series, more if you want to get technical, that could be considered in the horror thriller genre, but 3 that are most well remembered and 3 that we're going to talk about here. Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. Each one of these was hosted by a creepy, ghoulish character. For Tales from the Crypt, it was the Crypt Keeper, who is probably gone on to become the most famous of the trio because of the 1990s TV series anthology of the same name. We've also got the Old Witch in The Haunt of Fear, and then the Vault Keeper in The Vault of Horror. EC Comics was, maybe not started by William Gaines, but he definitely perfected it. He inherited it from his father, who was more interested in doing very, very kid-friendly comics. Gaines wanted to branch out and started doing other things like fantasy comics, science fiction comics, and of course, horror, as well as some suspense and thriller stuff. These 3, Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear, would go on to become incredibly popular. And it's no wonder, with art talent from the likes of Jack Davis, Johnny Craig, Jack Kamen, and a lot of other super talented individuals, who I hope Philip is showing you some of their art right now. You are, aren't you, bud? The stories usually had twist endings, usually had some sort of moral, poetic justice, almost always taken to a crazy extreme, because horror comics. And they're good. I mean, they were written in the 1950s, they're still pretty good. At the very least, the art certainly still holds up. I might be biased, but I highly recommend checking them out in whatever form you can. Now, these ran for 91 issues, and then things got bad. Not just bad for horror comics, but bad for comic books in general. See, this is when the Comics Code Authority came along and decided that comic books of all types were turning children into juvenile delinquents and causing them to commit crimes or something. It's the same old song and dance that we've seen over and over again, not just with comics from the 1950s, but also video games in the 1990s, and in the 2000s, and also still today. While many publishers agreed to go by the Comic Code Authority's rules, EC couldn't with their horror comics. Or they could, but they wouldn't be scary anymore. They essentially wouldn't be horror comics. Also, William Gaines, the founder and head of EC Comics, thought that the Comics Code rules were not great. For example, even outside of Gaines' horror comics in one of his science fiction series, he received a call telling him to take the sweat off of a black character in one of his sci-fi stories. This wasn't a Comics Code rule, but it was one that the people in charge of the Comics Code were attempting to enforce on him, or they wouldn't publish his comic. Gaines said no, and they didn't give him the comics seal of approval, which didn't mean that he couldn't sell the comic, but it did mean that most places wouldn't carry it. And if nobody will carry it, nobody could buy it. And of course, at the time, most people who were buying comics were children, which meant that most of them were relying on their parents to buy it for them, which wasn't going to happen if it didn't have the Comics Code on it, and probably wasn't going to happen if it was a horror comic in general. Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear died. But they were not forgotten, and horror comics in general were not forgotten, and persevered in various forms throughout the years. DC's House of Mystery and House of Secrets, though after the Comics Code thing, they bent more towards superhero tales. They were still horror-ish. Marvel Comics had much the same issue with their strange tales. They sort of went more into superhero-esque stuff, but still horror-ish. Archie Goodwin for Warren Publishing. Good old Archie Goodwin. There's a picture of Archie Goodwin, Philip. There it is. Decided to try to keep the horror comics alive under the Comics Code Authority, and did so with Creepy and Eerie. Not the most original titles, I'll grant you, but I mean, they let you know what you were getting in for. Creepy ran from 1964 to 1983, and Eerie ran from 1966 to 1983. Both actually pretty solid. Both also, it should be noted, only ever done in black and white. That was to get around some of the Comics Code rules. In 1971, the Comics Code finally relaxed a bit when it came to horror comics, and boy, publishers really jumped on that. We got The Tomb of Dracula, Morbius the Living Vampire, Swamp Thing, Ghosts, I believe a whole bunch of other stuff from a whole bunch of other not DC and Marvel comics also sprang up around the time. And of course, Archie Goodwin's Warren Publishing comics, Creepy and Eerie, which were still going at that time, could really embrace more during that time period, and did to a certain extent. They didn't go super crazy. I mean, they already had a good thing going. The 80s and 90s saw a revived Vampirella and a revived Ghost Rider series, as well as Hellblazer, Sandman, and a slew of other things from a whole bunch of indie publishers. The late 80s and early 90s was a big time for indie publishers. That's a completely different video covered by someone that exclusively does comics. Going into the modern age, we had Hellboy, 30 Days of Night, and The Walking Dead, which is super famous now, unless you're watching this in the far future and The Walking Dead has been off the air and forgotten for many, many years. In which case, The Walking Dead was like crazy popular for some reason. It was real popular, this show. Got a spin-off? Crazy, just about zombies. I don't know. And of course, it's also worth mentioning of Junji Ito, or Junji Ito. He's Japanese, I don't know how to say his name. I guess I could look up the proper pronunciation, but During the 80s and 90s, and I believe on through today, he did horror comics in Japan, and some of them are, oh boy. Definitely look a few of them up on the internet, please. I believe The Mystery of the Amagura Fault. Is that how you say that, Philip? Just put it up on the screen. Just figure out what it's actually called and put it up on the screen. Go look that one up. That's don't look it up at night. Or do. I'm not your mom. You do whatever you want. Horror comics have had a long and storied history, and I highly recommend checking out at least a few of the ones that I mentioned today. If you're not super into older comic stuff like the Tales from the Crypt and various other things, then I mean, there's lots of good stuff throughout the decades to check out in various degrees of scary. But that is going to do it for this week. I will see you all next week. I hope. If you come back, like, comment, subscribe. If you want, please, for this video, do it. Anyway, I will see you all next week for more spooky stuff. Yeah.